Good morning. I want to thank everybody for coming to our conference this morning. We hope and expect it's going to be an interesting time. We've called this conference Growth and Equity. And in that sense, it's not your usual Washington Conference on Tax Policy. In fact, if it were, we might have called it Growth and Inequity, since what you usually hear at conferences on tax policy in this town is economists or analysts explaining why most Americans need to be worse off if we're going to make our country better off. Usually you hear calls for why we need more inequality, more unfairness if we are to achieve our nation's economic goals. That's not what we're here to talk to you about today. There is, however, a whole generation of economists in this country who are trained to tell you that there is a conflict between growth and fairness. And you see their views reflected every day in the business pages in the newspapers. It's sort of an Orwellian kind of reverse speak where good news is bad news and bad news is good news. You'll see a headline or a story that says, "Unemployment down, Wall Street worries," or "Fall in wages, cheers analysts," and so on. You know, the way most business reporters cover the economic news, it's almost like opening up the sports page and finding the sports writers rooting for the other team. It's a strange way to report what's going on in our economy. But when you stop to think about it, the idea that there's a fundamental conflict between growth and fairness, it doesn't make very much sense. Sometimes it seems to me, at least, that you think that these business economists are trying to make America more like the third world, or maybe even the second world. After all, there's plenty of economic concentration, plenty of unfairness in the third world, and it doesn't seem to make those places better ones to live in or more successful economically. And as for the second world, well, there's a revolution going on in this country right now, and not in this country, there's a revolution going on around the world in the communist countries against excessive concentrations of economic power. And whether it's an all-powerful state or an all-powerful big business, it doesn't seem to work. The genius in this country has been our ability to spread things around, to spread around the economic power, to spread around the political power. And Henry Ford once figured out that unless he paid his workers a living wage, they wouldn't be able to afford to buy cars. And when he forgot it, his unions reminded him of it again. We all pretty much understand instinctively that excessive concentrations of power and wealth are bad. That's why we have antitrust laws. That's why we regulate natural monopolies. That's why we need campaign finance reform. It's one reason we have progressive taxes. But sometimes in our history, we forget this truth. The 1920s were one of those times. We know what happened after that. The early 1980s were another one of these times. In the name of what they called free market economics, we got economic concentration, we got widespread government business corruption, and we got a tax system who forgot who ought to be taxed. So we made most people poorer, and we impoverished the nation at the same time. Now, the people who put this policy into place, they said they wanted more savings and investment, but we got less. And the truth of it is they didn't really want that. That wasn't their goal. If you read the books that the supply-siders read, you find that they'll tell you that government borrowing is the way they want to fund the government. And they did. And as they soaked up our national savings to pay for tax giveaways to the wealthy, we ended up with high interest rates. We ended up with a big trade deficit. Anybody here remember we had a trade surplus in 1980? We ended up with hugely inadequate public investment. And we ended up with an economy with more millionaires and less well-off ordinary people. That's not good for business. It's not good for the average families of this country. And as you'll hear here today from speaker after speaker, I hope, the truth is that growth and fairness go hand in hand. Now, the 1980s, as I said, were a tumultuous decade for tax policy. It started with a big attack, a major attack, on tax fairness and on fiscal sanity. The 1981 tax bill reduced tax fairness, and it inflated the budget deficit beyond everyone's wildest dreams. While it let inflation push taxes up on most people, it slashed taxes for the very wealthy. It almost destroyed the corporate income tax, And it instituted so many new tax shelters that tax avoidance became the name of the game for American business. I remember back in 1982 there was an ad in one of the business publications from one of the accounting firms, and it said, and I quote, "If your company is still paying taxes, then you haven't heard about the 1981 Tax Act. Call us." And as I said, the 81 Act made a shambles of federal budget policy. It made responsible budget policy, in fact, all but impossible until the tax issue was dealt with. Now, the rest of the 80s were devoted to trying to undo what had been done in 1981. And that fight was led by Senator Bill Bradley. And ultimately, in the Tax Reform Act of 1986, Congress did take back about a quarter of the tax cuts that had been given the extremely wealthy. It did use the money to roll back some of the tax hikes that had been imposed on average people. It did close down many of the tax shelters that had been burdening our economy. But there's much more to do. We still face a situation where most people are paying higher taxes than they did before the supply side cuts, where the very rich are paying far less, and as a result we have a gigantic deficit. We do want to deal with the deficit because we do think as a nation we're spending more than we produce. It's pretty obvious. We want to cut consumption, but the question is, whose? Now, George Bush has an answer. He wants to repeat the policies of the early 1980s. He wants more tax cuts for the rich. He wants more cuts in needed federal investment. And these days, he sounds like he wants higher taxes on average people.